Alright guys, it's time. The whole point of US history in 8th grade is to get to the Civil War and complete it and basically give you a firm understanding of US history from when we were not even a US country, as in like when Columbus came over, and all the way to the Civil War here. Hope you guys are doing really well. Let's get right to it. So, the surrender of Fort Sumter. With Fort Sumter out, President Lincoln had declared a rebellion had existed in the South, and to put down said rebellion, he asked the nation's governors to raise 75,000 troops to basically go in the South and basically say, enough of this nonsense, let's handle and be civilized and stuff. A lot of free states were eager to volunteer, however, not all states were as eager. The still slave states. There were still some states who had slaves at this point, who had remained loyal at this point, but when they saw that Lincoln was sending troops, they were like, ooh, this could lead to Lincoln maybe getting rid of slavery for us as well, so we should leave also. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, they all joined the Confederacy. Interesting thing about West Virginia, though, I think that's one of the more interesting things about how a state was created. Prior to the Civil War, there was just one big Virginia. However, once Virginia decided to leave and join the Confederacy, the people in the western side of Virginia did not want to leave. There's literally a mountain in between them, the Appalachian Mountains. And the people on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains didn't have slaves. People in whereas Virginia today did. So they refused to leave. They said the rest of the state can basically go, but we're going to stay. And Congress will honor that by making those 50 counties into the state of West Virginia. Now, before we get to some actual fighting, Lincoln is going to have to secure the Union and make sure no more states are going to leave. Can't have more states leaving over and over and over, and eventually you have none left. There were still 4 slave states that had not succeeded at this point, and those are known as border states. They're states that are on the border near the South that have have slaves, but yet remained loyal. Delaware, for instance, had strong support for the Union. I mean, they're the first state of the United States. Of course they want to stay with the Union. So even though they had slaves, they said, we'll stay. Kentucky, not so much. Kentucky wanted to stay neutral. Union generals wanted to occupy Kentucky to tell them that you must not be neutral. You must help us out. Fortunately for Lincoln, Lincoln knew the birthplace of his home state. And he knew that if you tried to push Kentucky either way, Kentucky will do the exact opposite. So he left Kentucky alone, and ultimately Kentucky stayed. Missouri and Maryland, they were forced to stay because of strategic reasons. Missouri has a huge chunk of the Mississippi River, and the Union would be in bad shape if the Confederacy controlled all of the Mississippi. And Maryland is right next to our nation's capital. In fact, if Maryland was a slave state that went to the Confederacy, it was a slave state, but if it went towards the Confederacy, then Washington, D.C. would have been surrounded. So Lincoln does martial law and basically says you can't leave whether you like it or not. Now, isn't that against the law? I mean, if you think about it, if Lincoln could just do that, then why not do it with every other state? Do you think that might go against the president's powers if the president can just force states to do things the states don't want to do? Absolutely, it is against the rules, and Lincoln broke a lot of rules as president. But you may question his methods, but you can't question his results, as in, look at what happened, we win the war. Now, before we get into even any fighting whatsoever, a tale of the tape. A tale of the tape in boxing is where you take all the statistics, heights, weights, verticals, etc., and compare the two combatants. Likewise, let's look at it from the north and south, just to give you guys an idea of who has the advantages. So here's our map of it. Everything in red is the Confederacy. Everything in blue is the Union. So obviously, as far as like territory-wise, the Union has it. Everything in gray are the border states, by the way, the ones that were slaves states that remained loyal, whether they chose to voluntarily or involuntarily. Now, let's talk specifically about the Southern advantages. First advantage, home field advantage. Most of the fighting is going to happen in the South. If you've ever played a sport, it's easier to play defense than it is to play offense. They know the terrain, they have home court advantage. That's a huge advantage for them. And the second advantage they have is they have every single top military general in the South, because all of the academies are in the southern areas of the United States. So people like a Robert E. Lee, people like Stonewall Jackson, they will be part of the Confederacy. So they have the home field advantage, and they also have the better commanders. Now, the North's advantages are they kept all the factories, because all the factories are pretty much in the North. That goes way back, going way back in our units, talking about with like Hamilton's ideas and stuff like that. People farmed in the South, people made products in the North. And they also had a population advantage, as in 2/3 of the US population was in the North. And they also got to keep the Navy. That's going to be absolutely vital because the South is going to consistently try to ask the British to help during the war because the British relied on Southern cotton for their textile industry. If the British had declared war on the Union, we would have lost completely. And there was also new technology that the North had at its disposal. Like, we have the technology. And it's going to change the way tactics and pacing is going to work for this war. Stuff like rifles and ironclads are going to be super instrumental for the North. I mean, that boat may look like it's like half sunken, but it can take a bullet a whole lot better than a wooden ship. And the rifles are going to extend at farther ranges, be easier to reload, easier to maintain, and also easier to produce because they have the factories. And they also have all the railroads. I mean, there's still some railroads in the South, but the biggest railroads, like the Transcontinental Railroad, goes through the North. And they also have all the telegraph lines, so they could send messages very, very quickly. So there are your advantages for both sides. The South has the home field and the better generals. The North pretty much has everything else. Here's your first battle of the Civil War, the first battle of Bull Run. So the general of the North, a guy by the name of Irvin McDowell, wanted to take some time to turn his forces into a capable fighting force. However, due to outside pressures, as in we need to end this war very quickly, he was then forced to go to try to capture Richmond. Now, why Richmond? That's the Confederacy's capital. If you take down the capital of the Confederacy, then the war would be close to being over, right? If you look at that map also, look how close it is to our capital, Washington, D.C. So the fighting was really close. I mean, granted, this was a war within the United States, so you get the idea. The first battle of Bull Run. McDowell had 30,000 men and he left Washington and marched southwest into Virginia. The South was waiting at Manassas, which was a railroad. The outcome, they clashed at a river called Bull Run on July 21st. Despite initial success, the South held strong like a stone wall, which is why the General Thomas Jackson got the name Stonewall Jackson. No matter how many troops were being sent in, it was as if the wall would not budge. And eventually the tide will go to the point that the South is going to win this first battle of the Civil War. The Union will be forced to retreat, and the South was too exhausted to pursue. At that point, Lincoln fires his general. Because at that point, it's like, okay, you didn't do what I wanted you to do, so I need to bring someone else in. And he replaces him with a guy by the name of George McCullen. So that's the first general Lincoln is going to fire in this war. He's going to fire a lot more. This guy McCullen, how does he do? He doesn't do well either. In Chesapeake Bay in March 1862, he loses to Robert E. Lee. The Union had 100,000 troops. Robert E. Lee only had 15,000 troops. Does that sound like he did a pretty terrible job? Again, the North doesn't have the good generals, so Lincoln has to deal with what he has. But if I was Lincoln, if I heard my general lost when he was supposed to face an army of 15,000 people and he had 100,000 people, I'd fire him immediately. Especially now that after Chesapeake Bay, Robert E. Lee was then marching towards the North. However, McCullen had something that would save his job, briefly. And that was the interception of Robert E. Lee's battle plans. McCullen, by divine interference or maybe luck, I'll let you guys debate that one. I'm going to just say it's God's plan. McCullen would intercept Robert E. Lee's plans and take those battle plans and use them against Robert E. Lee in the next battle. And that was going to lead to the bloodiest day in the Civil War, which is known as the Battle of Antietam. But first, let's put that in perspective so we understand. Imagine if you were like in a football game. Imagine if the other team had your playbook. In the case of that situation, it's the same thing happening here with the Union in the South. McCullen literally knows all of the strategies Robert E. Lee is going to use, his call signs, how many soldiers he's going to bring, what weapons he's going to bring, all that different stuff. And if you have the other team's playbook, it should be pretty simple. You know what they're going to do in that battle, so counter it. Antietam realistically should have been the end of the Civil War, but Robert E. Lee was too good of a general to be defeated like that. And that's where the Battle of Antietam starts, September 17, 1862. It's known as the bloodiest day of the Civil War. The Union lost 12,000 soldiers in one day, and the South lost 14,000 men in one day. I wonder how many people that is, like, per minute are dying on U.S. soil. Now, despite having the entire battle plan of Robert E. Lee actually does a pretty decent job in Antietam. He doesn't get conquered, he retreats, but he holds his own. So who technically won? Technically the North, because Lee retreats. However, Lincoln is going to fire McCullen after this, because Lincoln knows that McCullen had the battle plans, and also he did terrible without the battle plan. So how well is he going to do when he doesn't have battle plans next time? Now, while this failure to even get a decent general in the East was going on, there was actually a pretty good general in the West that was having great success for the Union. So while McClellan was cautiously moving around in the East and facing Robert E. Lee and not doing really well, a guy by the name of Ulysses S. Grant is going to be super successful in the armies out West. Reason being is because Grant took chances and they ultimately paid off. Now, in the year of 1862, Grant is going to start operations to seize the Mississippi River. You capture the Mississippi River, that would be really, really important. Why? Well, think about it. That would basically split the Confederacy in half. Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana would be cut off from Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee. And the Mississippi is vital for transporting troops, munitions, all that different stuff. So, in other words, Grant's having great success in the West, but where the fighting is happening at its like heightened, where the capitals are, the Union's not having much success. However, after Antietam, Abraham Lincoln is going to do one of the most influential documents in our nation's history, the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln changes his mind. At the beginning of the war, he didn't want it to necessarily make it a slave issue, because of those border states that had remained loyal. But now he realizes it needs to be a slave issue, so he is going to emancipate the slaves. That leads to like a however, even though Lincoln didn't want those slave states that remained loyal to leave, freeing the slaves would change the tide of the war. It's kind of like the John Brown approach. If you let the you let the lion out of the cage, the lion will fight its own battles. Do you think the slaves are just going to walk off of plantations without saying a few choice things to their former masters? I think they would. Imagine if the South had to deal with both a rebellion of slaves, which was 1/3 of their population, while also trying to fight Union soldiers. And that leads to the Emancipation Proclamation, which you guys will be doing a worksheet for right after this. A few days after Lee's retreat from Antietam, Lincoln worked on the Emancipation, and by January 1st, 1863, the final document was finished. Now, there's going to be more quotes and stuff that you're going to read in the actual worksheet, but just to kind of give you a general summary, all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free. Lincoln was saying that this war is now about two things. One, saving the Union. Two, getting rid of slavery. Although this really didn't do a whole lot if you think about it. This document only liberated the slaves in the South. Do you think the South cares about slaves being liberated in the South? Like, do you think like, oh, well, because Abraham Lincoln made it law, we got to let all of our slaves free now, otherwise we're lawbreakers. No, they're their own country at this point. They didn't care. Obviously, this will make things a lot easier after the Civil War, because that will make emancipating the slaves a whole lot easier. And it also helps out the whole anti-slavery cause. Abolitionists praise Abraham Lincoln for finally making the Civil War about slavery. People like Frederick Douglass were like, yes, yes, yes. Harriet Tubman, who was actually in the White House talking to Abraham Lincoln prior, was saying like, look, this is exactly what I told you for years. Let us join this battle, the slaves. Let us fight with you guys. The Southerners thought that Lincoln was obviously trying to do a slave revolt. Union soldiers were enthusiastic after losing so many battles to Robert E. Lee. They're like, yeah, anything to help us. I mean, we're tired of seeing our best friends die in front of us. And also another important point, and I'll end it with this point here. This keeps Britain out of the war. The British abolished slavery in 1833. If the British, which were very close to joining the South because they needed the cotton for their textile industry, if they had joined the war on the side of the South, we would have lost this war. But because Lincoln made the war about slavery, the British couldn't get involved. People would have rioted in the streets of London if they found out that Her Majesty's government was sponsoring a war to promote slavery, which they got rid of. And this also is going to unite African Americans in support of the war on the side of the Union. Anywho, that'll cover it for today when it comes to our Civil War. We'll just end right there with the Emancipation Proclamation. There's a worksheet. Make sure you do that Emancipation Proclamation worksheet and make sure you turn it in at turnitin.com. Tomorrow we'll get through some more important highlights of the Civil War. And then on Friday, we're going to be finishing up the Civil War as well as Reconstruction. Hope you guys are doing well. If you have any questions, by all means, let me know, guys. Other than that, take care.